Hi, and welcome to Property Insight. My name's Mark Ashworth,
Hi, and I'm Neil Harding.
and in today's talk, we're going to be having a chat about gross yield versus net yield. So, you will have heard of yields all the time when you talk about property, often not necessarily initially return on investment, but certainly about yield. So, what does yield mean? What actually is it? And what's important about the difference between gross and net? So, shall we have a talk about gross yield first, Neil?
Like you say, so the idea of yield, really it's an indication of the amount of money you're going to make from your investment, and that's what it's all about. So gross yield is a calculation which you may have heard a lot of property investors talk about, and I think the reason why people like it is because actually it's relatively straightforward and quick to calculate. So just to talk about the maths for a moment, gross yield is calculated by taking your gross annual rental income divided by the purchase price of the investment property expressed as a percentage. So what does that mean? So to give an example, let's say you've got a property that rents out at £500 per calendar month. Okay, across a year, that's going to be £6,000 of rental income for a year. Say you purchase a property for £100,000. So the 6,000 over the 100,000 expressed as a percentage is 6%. So your gross yield in that scenario is 6%. Okay. The reason why I like using gross yield is because it's a very quick way of immediately giving you an idea of, well, okay, is this going to give me a decent level of income, decent return? If that number's below my investment criteria, if it's like, if it's a 2%, 3% number, that's quite a low return, and I probably wouldn't go any further with my due diligence and waste my time on looking at all the other financials.
And I guess if you're buying the property with a mortgage, clearly there's going to be some fees to come out each month for the mortgage. So isn't that gross yield value going to give you some indication as whether or not you're going to get any kind of cash flow after you've paid that mortgage? I mean, let's say if the gross yield is 3%, let's say, chances are if you mortgage it, you're just not going to get the mortgage, or it's not even going to make any money every month, right?
That's a really good point. Yeah, you may well immediately be failing stress tests on mortgage lending, especially if you think that mortgage products at this point in time, they're often at around 6%. Mm-hmm. So if your gross yield is not even 6%, it's going to be difficult to get lending and make that stack as an investment to give you any kind of profit at the end of the year. Yeah.
So what about variations on that calculation? I mean, what about other things like stamp duty and legal costs and stuff? Yeah. Is it worth including those or not really?
Well, some people do, and it really is down to your own choice and what you prefer. I don't, on the basis that I think it complicates the calculation. Your legal costs may be on average £1,500 or something per transaction. So if you include them every single time. If you don't, then exclude them every single time. Ultimately, what this is about is being consistently calculating your yield number so that you can compare all of the investments that you're looking at in the same way. And once you've done that a number of times, you'll get a feel for which of the investments that come your way look good and which ones don't.
And I suppose the last thing to mention on this gross yield factor is that we're assuming that the purchase price of the property is a property that is pretty much rentable in its current condition without you adding any value to it. So if you've gone and looked at a property at estate agents and you're planning to rent that out straight away, let's say all the things are in pretty good order and the letting agent or the estate agent has recommended that you could rent it in its current situation, then your gross yield will be based on that figure. It would be slightly different if you were buying the property in a very bad state and then you were intending to refurbish it. That is typically when gross yield doesn't necessarily work in that calculation, because you'll need to factor in your refurb costs.
Yeah, that's right. Not at the very start. You'd probably want to do another set of calculations with assumptions based on where you end up after a refurb. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. So net yield. So So net obviously means that you've got a gross amount and you're taking off some costs and factoring in things like that in order to get to that net yield. So what sort of costs are you talking about in these calculations?
Yeah, that's right. Once you've calculated the gross yield and you like what you see and you want to do some more analysis on whether this is a viable investment for you, then net yield is a good next step to go to. And net yield, well, I'd say calculate that by starting with the gross rent. So carrying on from that example with numbers before, where there was £6,000 of rental income. If you deduct from that the costs that you expect to incur in your rental business, so maybe that's, I don't know, £500 for repairs and maintenance perhaps would be reasonable. £3,000 for mortgage interest perhaps would be reasonable. So let's just say you end up with £2,500 of profit before tax on that investment. If the purchase price of the property was £100,000 again, as it was in the previous example, then you've got a net yield there of 2.5%, 2.5%. So that's a good indication for you of what's the level of return I'm going to actually get on the profit I'm going to make. And if you apply the same consistent approach to every single investment that you're stacking up, that's where the strength of that calculation is. So keep your methodology the same every single time. One good thing about net yield is that, when you're investing, you might be looking at leasehold, you might be looking at freehold. The thing with leasehold is, as you may know, service charges can vary wildly on how expensive service charges are. Ground rent can as well, for that matter. But on a leasehold, you're going to incur probably service charges and ground rent. So the net yield number will take into account the level of cost of that as well, which might be quite different if you're looking at a freehold opportunity. So it's important to look at net yield as your next step, I think.
So I think that wraps up our little chat about gross yield versus net yield. We really hope that you've found that insightful, and we look forward to you joining us on the next one.
Thank you.